On February 9th of 2004, 21-year-old UMass student Maura Murray drove from her dorm in Amherst, Massachusetts to the White Mountains of New Hampshire.
At approximately 7:27 p.m., Maura spun out her 1996 Saturn on a hairpin turn on Route 112 in North Haverhill. There has never been a credible sighting of Maura since.
Maura is 5 foot 7 inches tall. She weighs 120 pounds, and she has brown hair and hazel eyes.
If you have any information regarding Maura's disappearance, please submit it to us, the Murray family through their Facebook page, or the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit.
This is Missing Maura Murray. Welcome back to the Missing Maura Murray podcast. I'm Tim, here today with Lance in the Crawlspace studios in Wormtown. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing very well. How are you today?
I'm doing well. And for this episode, Lance, we have our friends, Doctor Shiloh and Dr. Scott from the hit podcast, LA Not So Confidential. Of course, a new podcast on the Crawlspace Media Network.
That is correct. You can check out the new shows that we have going on at crawlspace-media.com. The new shows and new events and announcements are listed there. And Dr. Shiloh and Dr. Scott, while I'm immediately intimidated by people with PhDs and people who even call themselves doctors, these are not intimidating people. They're very easygoing. The interview was really fun, and they have a lot of knowledge about everything they do, and you have to trust them because they are doctors.
That's good, Lance. That's exactly right. They did yell at me one time, though, in Chicago, but I won't bring it up here. So check out the show LA
You
Not
just
So...
kind of brought it up.
Well, I'll just move on because it's a good interview, and they're good people, except for that one time in Chicago. And I hope you like their show. Please subscribe to that. There are links in the show notes. And so this episode, Lance, specifically is about people who disappear on purpose.
Which is a really fascinating, I don't know if you'd call it a phenomenon, but it's a really fascinating topic because you have to identify the factors that go into each one of those specifically. You know, no one goes missing on purpose for the exact same reason.
Okay, so I hope you enjoy the episode and check out LA Not So Confidential. Links in the show notes. Thanks a lot for listening.
And you can also swing on over to LA Not So Confidential's website. That is www.la-not-so-confidential.com. That's a dash in between all those words.com.
Welcome back to the Missing Maura Murray podcast. Doctors Shiloh and Scott of the LA Not So Confidential podcast. How are you tonight?
We're great.
We're doing well. Thank you. Thanks for having us back.
Thanks for coming back. It's great to meet you again and talk to you again. And you're on the Crawlspace network. This is very exciting.
It is.
We really need to make our way to Boston so we can do this live together in the same room.
I would love it. Are we talking? Did we just schedule a live show? Are we doing a live show somewhere in Boston?
Okay, I don't know about live, but where we can all sit down together because that didn't happen.
That is true. Yes,
I know.
Yeah, we're missing the opportunity. Yeah, next week will be the missed opportunity, unfortunately.
Yes, the American Crime Festival that didn't happen this November 8th, 9th, and 10th in Wildwood, New Jersey.
My goodness, it's like not even 2 minutes in, we've already breached that topic.
Why not?
The good doctors were going to join us there. They were going to do a presentation with Sarah Turney about her missing sister, Alyssa Turney, and it was going to be moderated by that snappy jacket-wearing John Lorden.
That son of a bitch.
It was really going to be an excellent panel discussion presentation, but of course it didn't happen because the American Crime Festival is not happening this year, and we are not affiliated with the American Crime Festival if they're doing anything in the future. But what a bummer! But thank you guys so much for being a part of it and really, well, buying plane tickets and just like planning things and things like that. So I guess my question is your thoughts on Alyssa Turney's disappearance. I know you had spoken with Sarah a bit, so I'm curious your thoughts on that case, and maybe that's something we revisit, or you guys can do something with her or something. I would just hate for that to be a missed opportunity.
Yeah, we're still trying to find some platform to do something with her because it is just, again, one of those cases that is so interesting and so disturbing. I mean, with Maura Murray, you have just kind of this empty feeling with it because you don't have a lot. And with Alyssa's case, you just have so many disturbing factors with her father. And it's really something I think we can offer some insight into just maybe what was going on there, but we definitely plan on doing something with her in the future.
Yeah, I agree, and we've had great e-conversations with her, and she's still interested in working with us, which I think is wonderful. And this is a particular case, as Shiloh was saying, where there's so much for us to work with. The descriptions of her father's behaviors, that's all we need to start forming sort of a three-dimensional profile for our listeners, and to maybe comment on, some of the more subtle behaviors that maybe people didn't pick up on, which is kind of hard to wrap your mind around us because he's such a enormous volatile character. You think you've heard and seen all of it, and I think there's more that we can add to the picture.
Yeah. So what do you mean when you say that there's so much to work with? I mean, I know you just said that there's everything that he's done, and it's sort of like one day a new piece of information comes out, and or a new video comes out of him, sitting outside of where Alyssa worked. Do you have like an official, I guess, diagnosis of what this person's like, even if he isn't responsible for something bad happening to her?
So this is where, we have to take a step back and say, ethically, what are we doing here by offering commentary? And we would never diagnose nor pretend as if we can do a comprehensive evaluation on someone that is not sitting in front of us in a room with confidentiality in place based on the circumstances. We're able to really talk to this person, observe them ourselves, and then have at the end of that an assessment that produces a diagnosis. So that you'll hear when we talk in our episodes, or when we're at a live event like True Crime Podcast Festival, when we were talking about Mary Kay Letourneau, we're talking about traits that person has that look similar to disorders that we're familiar with. But you're never going to hear us come out and say this is what our diagnosis is of them, because that would just be completely out of our scope of what our role is, as well as unethical. So having said that, to kind of answer the first half of your question, the fact that there is so much video and audio of Sarah's dad, I mean, it's a gold mine, because you usually don't have that in a case.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that we can look at and say, what is going on here? And what Scott and I do, especially with the fact that we've worked with sexual offenders and some particular types of incest offenders, is saying, that behavior really mimics what we see in this population. But of course, we would never come out and say it exactly about Mr. Turney.
Right, because you've never met him, and you've never had like an official I guess session with him. So are you concerned that all of the information that's put out about him is something that is skewed to make him look bad? Is that something that you might take into consideration?
The way I would respond to that is, in the podcast, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the host's name.
Are you talking about missing?
Octavia Zavala
Yeah.
of Missing Alyssa.
I think that really she does. I was impressed by her attempts to do an interview and to have a genuine conversation with him. But in the end, how it benefits the work that Shiloh and I do is basically nobody's editing anything. The guy's just talking, and he really enjoys hearing himself talk. And over over a long period of time, you get to compare a lot of stories that start to contradict each other. And in those contradictions, people, they exhibit a behavior called leakage, where they start telling on themselves, and they start telling on themselves about their cognitive process, their intellectual process, and their emotional process. And I absolutely, if someone was nefarious and they wanted to edit all of those interviews and make him look bad, I think he's actually kind of doing a great job himself. He's giving us, like I was saying, he's giving us a lot to work with.
So when you mention that leakage, is that almost a direct connection to what his ego is?
I guess the way I would be more direct in defining leakage is we use the term a lot in certain types of threat assessment and risk evaluation. And basically, leakage is a way of telling on yourself whether you're aware that you're doing it consciously or not, or whether it is volitionally motivated or not. People leak because there's so much emotion that their psyche is trying to contain. So it's not really about ego. I mean, that's sort of another domain in how we talk about identity development. But leakage gives us a lot of information. You'll hear law enforcement use it when they talk about how they interrogate people and do interviews, is you're always looking for those moments where people tell on themselves.
Okay, so you're almost talking about like an overload of information, not so much that this person secretly or subconsciously wants the world to know that they committed this crime and got away with it. You're talking about just simply an overload of information that they can't help but release.
Well, I'd say it's actually both of those things. I mean, those two things are not mutually exclusive.
Gotcha.
And the approach that you're talking about taking with Michael Turney, Sarah, and Alyssa's father, in sort of examining the case and him as a person, is that typical of your approach? Like, is that the forensic psychology approach?
No, this is something that we're applying our training and our experience to in, even though these are very real occurrences in the real world to real people, we're applying these to a scenario that people are consuming for entertainment. So this is not similar to what we do on a day-by-day basis. In very rare cases, for me at least, and Scott, you can talk if this is different for you and your unit that you work in. But I might, since I'm employed by a law enforcement agency, I may be asked to do a case-specific consultation, which means if a homicide detective or a sex crimes detective says, hey, we're kind of running out of leads on this case, can you take a look at it, Doc, and give us some thoughts? That would be through whatever they have officially, police files, interviews, audio, video. They pretty much open the complete case file to me. And then I could give them a little bit of information from my background. So like with Michael Turney, which really sort of piques my interest, is that there's a lot of factors present from what I have heard and seen so far. And I have not seen everything. I think there would actually be more to back this up once I see it. But that looks like types of incest offenders or intrafamilial offenders who lose a spouse and then end up grooming the older sibling to then become their partner and replace them. And so that's sort of what I would come to the table with and apply in this case is, okay, I have this background knowledge from working with these types of offenders. Here's what I'm seeing in this case that is similar. But it I'm thinking of it in the platform that we were going to do it in a live show. And even that obviously is very different. We're not doing our work live on stage for someone. But there's differences and similarities.
So what you're saying is I'm trying to unpack this all in my head right now. What you're saying is that from your previous experience and your training, what you've seen in Michael Turney's behavior is that I feel weird even saying it, he is trying to replace what he got from his wife with his daughter or stepdaughter.
There's similarities that I'm seeing at this point. And certainly the way that happens is not necessarily cold and calculated. It can be due to other stressors going on. And he may have a myriad of other things happening psychologically as well that can contribute to it. But yes, at this point, I'm seeing similarities to offenders.
And just to piggyback on what Shiloh is saying, in that particular behavior, I'm a psychologist, but I'm also a marriage and family therapist, and I'm the majority of my training and approach to working with families and couples is what we call a family systems model, where you kind of look at as the family interacting with each other is what we call a psycho-cybernetic model. And each part of that system is dependent on the others. And if something happens to one part of the system, the entire system will naturally try and do anything to replace or restore that missing part. So to a normal extent, it would be completely normal if, there's a nuclear family, and let me shake it up and reverse it a little bit. Let's say there's a nuclear family of mom, dad, and, 2 kids, male, female, with an older, like a young teenage male. Dad passes away. There are stressors in the family, and maybe there are cultural aspects that really emphasize patriarchy and the role of men and machismo in that system. It would not be unlikely that the system would then try and force on the teenage male the roles of an adult male, sort of like what we say, colloquially as like, well, you're the man of the family now. But what can also happen is there can be a diffusion of relationships where the mother in that relationship could come to be in an ersatz marriage relationship with her son. Now, I'm not saying it becomes a sexual relationship, but I'm talking about he becomes her emotional husband because she pulls him into that dynamic, which is really unhealthy because that keeps, the young man from individuating and developing on his own. And it also stunts the mother's growth. And it once again, it's a systemic model, and it can affect everybody in a negative sense. But as a therapist, we can insert ourselves into that model, and we can redirect, and we can reconstruct and put it into a more healthy configuration. What Shiloh's talking about is when it goes completely awry because one of the people in that system is really wired differently. Does that express it well enough, Shiloh?
Yeah. I'm glad you made the distinction that it doesn't need to turn sexual necessarily. But when it does, when what you described does, a lot of times it is with non-biological children, like as in this case that we're talking about. Having said all that, it doesn't mean that they killed her. We're just kind of looking at what is going on family systems wise, looking at risk factors and red flags with people who offend sexually, and especially within the family. I think there's just a lot of interesting points to the case that we probably, once we have access to video and audio of just daily happenings in that family, that we would just have more information.
Yeah, so what you're saying essentially is that when you have a family unit and one of those family members, especially if it's the the mother or the father, one of those units is lost, then there's going to be some natural longing or some natural like hole that needs to be filled because of that loss. And if you have these other contributing factors, like I think we know Michael Turney might have had, then you have to just add in all of those other things. Like what could somebody in this position with all of those factors have on top of it be capable of?
Correct.
Yeah, correct. I that's exactly sort of what we're saying in long form. It's just about, in the best case scenario, the surviving parent is able to recognize like, okay, I'm on my own now. And, the power dynamic's going to shift and all the roles are going to shift, but I'm not going to parentify my children. I'm not going to allow them to feel that they have adult responsibilities in this. And,
Right.
I mean, some of the things that came across in Missing Alyssa that were just so tragic was just about how, you know, she's described as just trying so hard, to meet the demands and keep bending and keep bending. And, he keeps changing the rules of the game. And what makes it particularly poignant is how all of her peers describe her at work, when she was away from her dad, that she just blossomed, that she was a competent worker and, admired and liked and had a great sense of humor. And then she had to sort of just shift into this other role whenever he was around.
What do you mean by changing the game?
I'm on my second run through of all the episodes. And one of the things that pops out for me is that he just kept having all these rules. And there was so much monitoring and so much gaslighting of, trying to convince her that she was developmentally disabled or had learning disabilities, none of which were evidenced. And they're on one hand, some of the ways she's described is that she was, somewhat rebellious. And yet there are other descriptions where she was just trying to be a kid that pleased the only parent that she had left. She would put up with some of this outlandish behavior, but it's almost like she was having to, not necessarily what we call code switch, but she would have to make identity shifts just for survival. She thrived in the work environment and did pretty well in school, except when she was forced into these, classes away from her peers. But then, people are commenting on how she shifted when they saw her around her dad. But once again, the game changing metaphor I was using is he just seems to be, in my recollection, that he just kept moving the goalposts all the time.
Not to keep going on this, but it's so fascinating.
I know it is. But yeah, it's a tragic case. Well, I really look forward to hearing what you and Sarah come up with. Let us know how we can help or promote some kind of combo of heads together for that. We'd love to be a part of that in any way we can. Okay, so let's pivot now to people who disappear on purpose. And this was something that we intended to get around to talking about the first time we spoke on these very airwaves. But as it just happened, time just ticks away, and we talk and it's so fascinating, all of this stuff. And so that's why. But we would love to hear some research that you've done into this.
I was talking to Shiloh earlier as we were sort of, talking about what our approach was going to be and who was going to cover what. And I did a deep dive into what information was available, which is a combination of some statistical research and some really good just sort of listicle articles that pick out particular examples. And the reason that even sort of the pop journalism versions of this are so important is that they give us a broad overview of the categories of people that disappear. And you start to see some trends, or at least I'm just right now in this overview, I'm starting to see some definite trends between men and women, and then the subcategories in men as to why they intentionally disappear. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me that I guess you would know it, but you don't know that you know it, or you don't realize that it's not against the law. It's not against the law in the US, and it's not against the law in Europe. I mean, certainly if you commit a crime in the pursuit of disappearing, if you commit fraud or you take on another identity, and by taking on another identity commit fraud, then you're liable, and you could pay the consequences for that. However, it's not against the law to just say, yeah, I'm done. I'm not going to talk to my family anymore. I'm out of here.
Yeah, I think I just want to say one quick thing here. I think that that's one thing that we had it gave us a surprise when we started doing our coverage on Maura Murray, and how a lot of people were talking about her case being an open investigation, and the word crime and criminal and all this was, especially in the early days, that was being thrown out there. But when you look at it, there's no crime that actually happened in that case, and that's a really interesting. I mean, the only crime that happened there was that she abandoned a vehicle, I guess, for the most part. So it's reassuring to hear you say that as well, that there is no crime that actually happens. What do you do when you find a abandoned vehicle on the side of the road, right? You're really not like committing a crime at this point.
Right, you're not. But in Mara's case, you extrapolate, like, as compared to most of the information we have from interviews of people who have come back, is, when they're found, you get the reasoning for it. And with Mara, like Shiloh was saying earlier, we just don't have enough information. It's different from other cases in that there is no, like you said, there is no evidence of a crime, but it just leaves this hole with no information. So we don't know what to do with it. I mean, it disturbs us, I think, on an emotional level when we look at cases like this.
This is one of those areas of the criminal justice system and investigation that I think is so interesting, because there is no crime, and so what is the duty of a law enforcement agency to investigate someone who's missing? Yeah, and I think I love that you made that point, Scott, because I think it's kind of blows people's minds when you stop and think about it. Just kind of like suicide. There's no law that says we have to keep people from killing themselves. There's no law that's saying if a police agency doesn't respond to a call of someone who's threatening suicide, that they're going to be held liable. People are allowed to kill themselves. Do they do it? Do they make every attempt possible? Of course. And some of that is changing, and how the way law enforcement is responding to that. Just now we're starting to see that, especially with suicide by cop type calls that are putting law enforcement officers in danger. But with missing persons, it's a very interesting investigation, because technically there is no crime. So what is the duty to investigate it? And I think the intentional missing or volitional missing are probably we just don't have the data. We don't know what we don't know. So we don't know what percentage of people go missing intentionally, and that's the frustration.
Shiloh's hitting on something that's so important, is because we don't have solid data, because a lot of the data that we do have to work with comes from Great Britain, including other areas of the United Kingdom, like Ireland. Ireland has like a phenomenally large amount of people that just go intentionally missing, and interestingly, not to escape financial burdens or anything. It's just there's something in the culture where a percentage of them just say, yeah, I'm out of here. And, they can travel freely within the UK, and it's easy for them to sort of reinvent themselves. But when we're looking at some of the stats that we do have, and this is from The Guardian, sort of quoting from Britain's National Crime Agency, it shows that about 91% of most police reported missing persons are closed within 48 hours. So that's significant right there, that the vast majority of people that go missing, those cases are closed for whatever reason within 48 hours. But then according to the LA Police Department, that has some great stats on this, about 80% of all reported missing persons are found or voluntarily returned within 48 to 72 hours. So that's actually pretty significantly, 80 to 91% is kind of different. And, but then again, we're also talking about Southern California as a large metropolitan area. And then, just reminding ourselves that not all missing adults or not all missing persons are the victims of either murders or kidnapping or some criminal act. But when looking at some of the reasons, the things that I found really interesting is that, some of the reasons that people can go missing, it can have to do with mental illness. And I think we'll see, when we broaden our term, or when we broaden that definition of mental illness, when people have, sudden onset of overwhelming stressors, that, that in itself is a mental illness and can affect certain individuals to sort of to walk away from any situation. But then there's also a good percentage that's based on miscommunication, where family members are just not communicating with each other and people disappear because they haven't made it clear what the plans were. And another thing, when we get into lines of gender, we talk about, a lot of women have to disappear because of domestic violence. And if they have successfully disappeared because they're escaping intimate partner violence, and if the only person who's reporting on it is their partner, well, then the partner is not going to be reporting that there was violence in the relationship, right? So we don't have a lot of stats in that way, because there is a great network across the world of safe houses for women to escape to, where they are very good at helping them disappear. So when we look at a growing group of missing people that you'll see in the news more and more often, is people with dementia. And that tends to happen more and more frequently in large urban areas where there's just not as much of a social network or social support network as there is maybe in sort of suburban or rural areas for the aged. Which is really sad. And I hope that we can get some legislation in place to address that. But what I found was that when you look at why people disappear, both men and women that are later interviewed describe it as they just couldn't see a way out. However, what's different is that the majority of the men could not see a way out of their financial problems. And then if you look further into the examples of those men that had the financial problems, they're actually sort of minimizing what their financial problems are. Their financial problems were brought on usually by either gambling, bad investments, or embezzlement. I mean, it's just amazing. Over and over again, these guys that are faking their deaths are because they really, really got themselves into financial, just a terrible morass.
It's not so much the case in the women's situation where they needed to get out of there for their own safety. They felt like they were in danger. You have these men who have sort of played loose and fast by the rules, and now they're in trouble, and it's to protect themselves.
Right. And then what you also see in the vast majority of the men in that situation is a further subcategory of men who had what we call a secondary gain planned. It was not only to escape their financial problems, but also to have a payout on the back end. So you're seeing a number of these guys that had life insurance policies that they were then going to have a child cash out, and they were going to hide out for 10, 15, 20 years.
So this is premeditated?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about, is a lot of them are premeditated in these examples. And those are the ones, it's interesting because so many of them get caught. It's just, especially, I think Shiloh had some really good data on this, on how it's just, this is not like it was in the 80s. It is really hard to disappear now.
There's a really great Wired article that highlights a case study of a guy that tried to do exactly what you're talking about, and takes you through the investigation, takes you through his mindset. But his plan was, he basically was going to fake his death, and he did it essentially right in front of his family, which was kind of cool to pull off that part. And then they weren't in on it, but a year later, he was going to recontact his wife, basically apologize, say, hey, I'm still alive, but you collected this money. Let's go start over. Well, within 2 months, he couldn't take it anymore, and he reached out to her. So, it's really interesting to look at sort of the psyche or the mindset for someone that could really follow through with this. And, if I had to sort of build a profile off of the data that we found, it's not going to be necessarily the person doing it out of complete desperation, like Scott's talking about, where they, don't see a way out and they have to come up with this plan. I mean, that really mimics people with suicidal ideation, which I'm sure you're going to touch on later, Scott. But you want someone, if you want to be successful at this, you want to have a little bit of a taste for risk, the ability to think and act pretty quickly and on the fly, and have that strong resistance to reconnect with people or your past. And those are some pretty foolproof traits to have if you're going to be successful at this. And that's what I saw in a lot of the case studies, was that if they had tried to plan this out in order to reconnect with family later, even if they were in on it to collect insurance money, that they really couldn't wait it out.
Now, why do you think that they can't wait it out? Is it because they get impatient about it, or do you think that they genuinely miss the company of whoever they've left?
Yeah, I think that there's a differentiation there. That's like a further subcategory. What Shiloh's talking about is those that really, regardless of the financial situation they created for themselves, they do have an emotional connection to, intimates and family members. And those are the ones that aren't going to be able to hold on for whatever the amount of time it is, if it's years. But those are in stark contrast to some of the more successful men who have disappeared that clearly have what we would consider to be some antisocial personality disorder traits that don't have any connection to their family. I mean, there's a couple of famous cases. One, Arthur Jones out of Chicago in 1979. He was a father of three, had a very lucrative job. I'm not sure if it was on the stock exchange, but big job in Chicago, very well paying. And he disappeared. Father of three, he had enormous gambling debts, just enormous gambling debts. And he was found 27 years later, no, 30 years later, living under another name, because he just when he was asked why, he just said, "Oh, I just wanted a fresh start." And now also he had a string of other crimes that he had committed that were all money based while under this AKA. So this is somebody that, like, in contrast to what Shiloh's giving his example, is someone that does not feel, an intimate or an empathic connection to family members. Richard Hoagland in 1993, he disappeared for 27 years. He was on the run from the law regarding embezzlement as well. But then in contrast to both of these, being connected to family versus not being connected to family, there was a 53-year-old Colorado man named Paul Kitterman, and he was with his family at a Broncos game, and he just vanished during halftime, just disappeared, and was found later 100 miles away, and sort of almost not really in a fugue state, but clearly suffering from severe mood disorder, such as a depressive disorder. And all he could say to the police that found him was that, yeah, I just got tired of football. So, when we look at the three major there's four major categories, but I think that three are the most important. So there's forced disappearance, obviously, where the person is a victim of foul play. But then there's the unintentional absence that we talked about, which might have as a stemming off of dementia or other mental health problems or an accident or, I guess what we'd call a misadventure. And then there's drifted, which is those who just kind of lost contact and they have sort of a transient lifestyle. And without, getting too clinical or putting a diagnosis on that, that I think the drifter category is going to include people with mental health issues or emotional problems, because sort of we all dream of running away from some of our biggest responsibilities that are overwhelming. But for the most part, we, get a good night's sleep, or we reach out to friends, or we take care of ourselves, and we kind of figure out how to get through it, which way sort of is a long way of describing what we would call resiliency. And this drifter category seems to be people that don't really have a lot of resiliency because they just move from situation to situation. And all three of those are in complete contrast to the main, intentional that we're talking about, which is decided. person, that relationship is broken down, they're escaping personal problems. And I'm so sorry, somebody has their
Oh,
hand
no
up.
worries. And you just got into decided, which is part of my question, I guess. So there's decided, and then there's the first one that you mentioned, which was like it was necessary because they were in an abusive situation. So then you have decided. So I guess that those two kind of overlap a little bit because you're in an abusive situation and
Yes.
you've decided to do this because of the abusive situation. And my question is, why are people disappearing and not going to authorities instead of abandoning their current life?
Well, I think in the one situation I can certainly speak to is that I think it's, if we are going to talk about women who are escaping violent relationships, there's not always a lot of trust that they feel that they can have in law enforcement. Shiloh, what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, I think it follows sort of the classic problems that domestic violence victims face. They're going to go to the police, and the police are going to get them a restraining order, and then what? It's a piece of paper. Especially if they have a particularly violent and intense partner who is very good at stalking, and if they're at that point where they're considering running away and starting their new life, it's probably for a reason, because that person is not your run of the mill um, batterer. They're going to stop at nothing to make sure that she does not leave alive. So I just don't think there's a lot of faith in the criminal justice system, because once you leave that police station, you got to figure out where you're going to go. They might help you call a relative or someone, but where's going to be the first place that perpetrator is going to look? Is the people that you know. So
Yeah, and I guess what is the responsibility of the investigating agency to tell the family of the missing person that they know this person went missing on purpose?
ooh, that's a really good question. I don't know. I can't really see that scenario where someone says, "Hey, police, I want to make this report. I'm going to go missing on purpose, but don't tell anyone." I don't know that they would let the cops know that. I think it's one or the other. They either report the person, and then you got to stick around, because then the police aren't going to follow the prosecution through if they don't have a victim, or they just go. You kind of choose one or the other. I don't think someone would inform the police and then take off.
So then I guess a follow-up is, how hard does the investigating agency work on this if they believe the person disappeared themselves?
Well, if they believe that's what happened, you need more than just a belief.
Right,
So is there
right.
evidence to back that up? There's
Yeah.
it would be similar to like a sexual assault. I mean, I handled plenty of rapes that I believed were not true and that were false accusations, but you bet I handled every investigation as if it was real and treated every victim as if it was real, because what if I'm wrong? And that's not for me to decide. It's for me to follow through with the best investigation possible. So,
Yeah. How often do you think that goes through law enforcement's minds, that they might be faced with a situation where someone is not being forthcoming with all of the information, but hey, what if they are? Do you think that, is there like a rough percentage you can put on that?
um, law enforcement officers are very
Right.
skeptical by nature. So I think all the time is my answer. You're constantly weighing that, whether it's someone reporting a theft, or it's someone reporting a rape, or someone reporting a missing person. I think, and I like it. I like that only in that I want the investigator, the patrol cop that's responding, to be open-minded to every possibility in the beginning. So to kind of give equal weight to everything while taking in the information and evidence that you're getting from witnesses or from physical evidence that you're seeing. But I really, truly believe you should be open-minded to everything at the beginning. And that means being a little skeptical to someone's story, or what is their possible secondary gain by making this police report when it's not exactly what it sounds like on the surface.
My experience dovetails with what Shiloh's talking about. I partner with law enforcement to investigate cases. And, when I worked in the prison system and when I've worked in clinics and in forensic settings, you always know that you have to extrapolate from the data that you're getting. You're only getting one facet of this individual's psyche, of what they're sharing with you. And it has just astounded me. And I feel like I'm a better clinician because of this. But in working with detectives, I've now learned that the way law enforcement operates is they have that healthy skepticism, and they're constantly taking in new information. And because every time you get more information, it can give you a 90-degree turn in your suppositions, and you have to remain open to that.
So it seems like there are categories developing
and subcategories.
Yeah, really. I feel like I need a graph to fully wrap my head around it.
There's a lot, and what we didn't even really get to touch on, that, I mean, because we live in Southern California, and we are now rivaling the homeless challenges that San Francisco and other large areas are handling. One of the things that we know about the homeless population in Southern California is that there's a high percentage of youth, that come here as minors. And of the people that come here as minors that are transient and homeless, the vast majority of them are LGBTQ youth that are basically thrown out of their houses by their families. And they have, the ones that I have encountered on a regular basis, have no further connection with their family. And it's not safe for them to. That actually in 2019 is still happening, where these kids are abandoned by their families, and as such, they end up going missing. Now, they may stay in touch with other family members through social media, but I've had the heartbreaking experience of reaching out to families and having, moms and dads hang up on me. Like, yeah, we don't want to have anything to do with him.
Is there a particular region that you find most of these youths are coming from?
The Midwest and the South.
And that's you didn't even hesitate there. That's definite. When you see something like that come in, it's most likely the Midwest and the South.
Yeah, there's a lot of assumptions about living in Los Angeles that bring a great deal of homeless. There's a lot of things that are sort of certainly seductive about coming to the West Coast. This is the center of entertainment, or one of the centers of entertainment, and there's the assumption that the weather is going to be amenable, all year round to living outside or living at the beach. And, the harsh reality is that, homeless youth get here, and unless they can find some kind of support system or take advantage of social services, they can end up on the street working in the sex trade, falling into drug use, and being even further isolated from their families of origin. But and we don't really have a lot of data on that in the crossover, the nexus to the amount of people that are reported as missing, because a lot of those parents are not reporting their kids as missing, which is tragic.
Oh, why is that? Why are the parents not reporting the kids as missing?
Well, if they threw them out because of their sexuality, then they're not going to report them as missing. It's fixed itself, right?
Or it's broken itself.
Absolutely. I mean, I was being facetious in saying that,
of course.
Because it's something that's, I feel very strongly about, and I see the repercussions. You just see kids' lives. It's just ridiculous that it's happening at this day and age.
Right. So do you think that a lot of these youths that you see and who have been ostracized from their family and their community, this might be part of the whole, quote unquote, missing intentionally? They're not like really seeking to go out there and not be found ever. It's just that they can't find a place to call home.
Right. So, yeah, I think I digressed a bit. It's not really so much the intentional missing as much as the intentional escaping from a situation that is not healthy for them.
I think the emphasis has to be repeatedly emphasized there.
Yeah.
So I guess, how many people who are categorized as missing persons do you think are actually intentionally missing? I know it's probably unanswerable, so I guess that's unfair of me, but I was channeling my inner Lance.
Stop it.
How dare you? That's terribly unfair.
I think that even as the data continues to come in, that's going to be the hardest thing to determine. I mean, it really is. It's going to be the hardest thing to determine because so many people disappear that are never found again. You know, we have, and especially women of color, indigenous women. I mean, we have, that confounds it. You know, we can make assumptions that, well, they were on that particular highway of death where everybody disappears, or did they go another direction? You know, that's going to be a hard number to tease out until we have more data. I mean, this is one of those things where, you know, you want to advocate for law enforcement agencies across the country to really start communicating about these things.
Yeah, that would really help things, and I know it's more complicated than just saying that. It's not like there's interconnected servers in all cases. You know, I think that would really help.
Right, and it may, you know, it might even be able to help. It might help to tease out the numbers if we look at it from a forensic standpoint, and we look at just knowing, if we know, and this is one of the things that we do have stats on, is that half of the adults that go missing are highly likely to be it's related to mental health issues. So without differentiating all the reasons for going missing, we know that mental health concerns are on average recognized in almost, I think, half of the reports of missing people. And it's, you know, particularly common among older persons, and then subcategory women, you know, women that just get overwhelmed. I mean, I'm making a generalization. I don't want to sound dismissive, but like, we have an example. There was a woman, Petra Pazitska from Germany in 1984, Denise Bolzer in 1985 in New Hampshire, Brenda Heist in 2002. All three of these women just decided, you know, they couldn't take living with their families anymore. You know, they left kids, they walked away and became drifter. What will, in further subcategories, some of them took on AKAs, and then one of them, Brenda Heist, walked away and just sort of had a breakdown in a park and was picked up by a drifter and disappeared for almost 20 years.
What seemed consistent is that in this day and age, it is much harder to disappear intentionally than it was in the 80s. So, of course, that's due to technology. When we're talking about percentages, to find people who are intentionally missing, you would first obviously have to have someone that reports it, and then do they have the means to hire a private investigator that can follow the technology trail, which is what trips most people up nowadays. So, yeah, I think it's hard to put a percentage on there, but it is much more difficult to disappear and not be found today.
I mean, I kind of agree with that, but at the same time, I kind of don't, because I feel like we're all very much more well-informed. So we know how to skirt the system and perhaps disappear successfully by maybe giving some red herrings here and some false leads there.
The hard part is creating the new identity.
Right.
That's, if you're going to disappear and then begin a new life somewhere else, the difficult part is creating a new identity. That seems to be the really difficult part.
Like a believable one?
Well, a believable one, or one that whatever government agency or country that you go into and sort of restart your life. Yeah, one that's going to be taken and filtered through the system. Private investigators say, you know, the surest way to be caught is to use some variation of your name or your date of birth or your social security number, switching those up. I mean, there are databases that they can just basically run variations of a person. And if someone just switches a couple of digits, they'll be found pretty quickly. So I don't know. I think it sounds like a lot of effort.
Yeah.
But as you were saying, Lance, like, you know, we do have more data at our fingertips to maybe teach us how to do that. So could work out.
It's also, and then we talk about, like, you know, your quality of life. I mean, what is it? It's kind of hard, I think, for the four of us to sit and, you know, we all have, you know, we're all in relationships. We had social circles. We have large connections that we're dealing with on a daily basis. And then you think about somebody like Whitey Bulger, who was on the run for so long and living basically hidden in an apartment in Santa Monica with his wife for decades, basically holed up in an apartment, occasionally going out to walk the dog. And, what kind of life is that? I mean, what are you trading it for? I mean, in his case, he was trading it for his life because he was a, huge criminal. But unless you have like a huge amount of money that somehow is translated into cash and you can somehow get overseas to Portugal, where you can have a great lifestyle for very, very little money, how do you make that happen?
I've been very fascinated with this man, Christopher Knight, who was 20 years old in 1986, and a book was written about him by Michael Finkel called Stranger in the Woods, and he just drove his car down a back road until he couldn't drive it anymore and walked into the woods and lived there for like 27 years or something. And that's how he lived. And then he was found and they brought him back and he, went to the dentist and they gave him a job. And all he could say was that he just didn't want to be around people. He just felt better being by himself and he didn't like the noise of everybody around him. And I wonder how many people are like that.
Well, look, I mean, everything that you just mentioned points towards a diagnosis. So, I mean, and I'm not gonna diagnose him, but if we look at all of those particular symptoms, that sounds like somebody who's on the spectrum and can't deal, can easily get overstimulated and overwhelmed with too many people, too many noises, too much pressure coming from all sides. So it would make sense in that particular person's functioning to think, I need to remove myself from all of this.
I don't know. I feel like that after a day of work sometimes. Like I just can't stand people anymore.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It takes a special skill set also to live in the woods for 27 years or whatever. I mean, obviously that takes not planning. I mean, some planning, but obviously some extensive training and building those skills.
Oh, yeah. I forgot to mention that this was the woods in like the middle of Maine. So he was there during the harshest winters.
I mean,
No,
but Shiloh, I feel you. I feel like just escaping in the middle of a workday sometimes too. Typically, it has
nothing to do with me.
Yeah, typically it has to do with my coworker, but
I knew that was. Oh, there we go.
You guys really need to go to couples therapy.
Yeah, nah, we're all right. I think. I hope.
Good. It's a healthy relationship. So.
I don't know. I just made an Amazon purchase of a reciprocating saw. It's just for some home improvements.
What?
Mom and Dad are fighting at the dinner table again.
Well, thank you both for joining us here. Is there anything glaring that we're missing in this conversation right now?
I've tied this concept to a couple of our podcasts because I'm becoming more and more fascinated with the idea that, as our population grows and our multicultural society continues to actually become more homogenized in certain ways, we're not really making room for people who are other. When I grew up, there were people in the neighborhood. There was, the little old strange lady who lived by herself and she was eccentric and odd. Those are the kind of things that we used to have more of a tolerance for in society. And now we avoid that. And in avoiding that, I think that we create more and more a sense of non-connection with people where, I look at these examples of people that disappeared, especially the women, they were overwhelmed. If they had had a support system, if somebody had been there to recognize that they were being overwhelmed, maybe that could have made a difference. So, I mean, not to get all hippy dippy on everybody, but I think it's about about lacking a sense of connection. And I think that we have to probably work harder at it now than people had to in the past because society sort of supported it, whereas we don't now. We can sort of, as we are right now, here's a perfect example that, the four of us are in 4 different geographic locations collaborating on this.
That is a great example.
And we're very lucky to have you both speaking about this with us.
Thank you. We're happy to talk about it. You guys have never talked about this on Maura Murray at all?
We actually have not. We've never focused a single episode on this. No.
Yeah, it's just, not necessarily everyone's favorite theory, but it is a theory. So, and I think was a strong one for some people for a while. So it's good. We're finally just kind of talking about it.
And I gotta say, listening to your podcast and all this information about Maura, I've listened to the whole thing a couple of times, and I feel like I get more information. And what I got the second time was really more a sense of sadness about the effect that it's had on the family and sort of the meta narrative of examining it after the fact and how that affects the family. But, in regard to what you just said, I mean, I kind of hope she did walk away. I hope that's the best, that's the best case scenario.
Definitely.
That she's still alive somewhere and she's created another life that's working for her, because the alternative is not great.
While I agree with that, the alternative is not great. I think no matter what the alternative is, by talking about this and by saying that this situation happens and there are so many contributing factors currently, and there are contributing factors that we were raised with in the past, I think that should open up a dialogue for more analysis on why people would do this, even if this isn't the solution in Maura's case. At least it's brought that to the forefront.
Before we go, what is coming up next or soon on LA Not So Confidential?
Ooh, we have a really good episode for you sometime this week. We are going to be talking about killer nurses. Something terrifying. There are
Annie Wilkes?
way more out there than you think. Yeah, we will be talking about Annie for sure.